In this video, we're going to take an overview look at how to use Retrofit to easily parse JSON into plain old Java objects. We're going to discover why. Well, with Retrofit, it handles a lot of the dirty work for us, the threading, making a network connection, and then parsing JSON data into objects. And the other big reason why is the business value. There's a lot of data that's available over the internet, some of it commercially available and others for free, but in this JSON format, because the JSON format is an easy interchange format. And with Retrofit, it makes it easy to take a feed of JSON data and convert that into objects. Once it's in objects, then we can use our logical operations in our programming language to do operations on those objects and create value out of that. In other words, take data and create information out of it. So using Retrofit has many moving parts, and I find this easiest to explain with example. First of all, up here we have an endpoint with some JSON formatted data. JSON formatted data is a fairly straightforward format, a fairly flat format that stores data in a text-based form but without a whole lot of overhead. So nonetheless, we have our JSON data here. Now, as an application developer, what do I need to do? Well, number one, I need to import Retrofit into my project. If it's a Maven project, it's a POM entry. You can either do that manually or your IDE might be able to help. Once you've imported Retrofit, you can create this Retrofit client instance. And the Retrofit client instance really manages several other things. One thing that it manages is this DAO interface that you will create. And I emphasize it will be an interface. By that I mean you're simply defining a method name, what it returns, and how that method will be called. But Retrofit will actually create the implementation of that method. So you're just creating the method name. Retrofit behind the scenes will essentially create kind of like an anonymous class that implements that method. So what you'll do is above that method, you'll use an @get annotation to say this is the endpoint that I want to access. The endpoint is where you're going to find your JSON data. One other thing that you're going to need is a data transfer object, or DTO, that is essentially a noun class, and what we can do is take the JSON and stuff it into the noun class. So in other words, the DTO that we create here will be a structural representation of the JSON that we're about to read. So we put this all together with the Retrofit client instance, and then we can read the JSON as text, and out of this DAO interface, we will get actual JSON objects. We can have some higher level class like a DAO coordinate this. So a DAO, data access object, is something a lot of times we'll have around an entity, a noun, like a car DAO, a promotion DAO, a person DAO, something like that. So in our case, we'll call this a plant DAO. So a service class can coordinate with multiple DAOs, and then a controller class can call the service class. So finally, what we'll find is that we're able to get our data all the way up to the controller, and then it's viewable by our user interface. The controller and the service are really a separate conversation from Retrofit. What I really wanted to show in this diagram is how Retrofit client instance coordinates this interface DAO in this DTO type, along with our logical, we'll call it our plant DAO in this case, or our entity DAO if you want. So Maven dependency, here's one of the dependencies. We'll actually use our IDE to help us with this Maven dependency. DTO we know is just a noun class. I described that a little bit earlier. This will be used to help us turn that JSON into actual objects. Serialized name is an annotation that might come in handy. If we're lucky, our JSON name value pairs will have names that match identically to the attributes in our DTO classes, capitalization and everything else. But we can't realistically plan on that. The names might be different. One might call it a GUID, the other might call it an ID, another might call it a unique identifier or a UID. So we can use this annotation called serialized name to map from a Java attribute to a JSON name. That typically goes on the DTO attributes itself. Retrofit client instance, we talked a little bit about this. This is the coordinating class. One thing we'll do here is we will define a base URL, which is essentially the domain name of the service that we're going to call. We're also going to use the singleton design pattern for this class, which means we'll only have one retrofit object, and we'll essentially have a factory method that always returns that single object. So the singleton pattern. DAO interface, this is one that I think is really neat because this is the one where you're just defining that method. We use the @get annotation to define the endpoint. Now the endpoint is relative to this base URL that we defined on Retrofit Client Instance. So those two together should make a total URL. You shouldn't have any duplications between the two. In other words, the endpoint should not start with http:// where a lot of times the base URL will start with http://. One other annotation that we can use is the @query annotation, and this allows us to take parameters from a method and use it as filter criteria for the endpoint that we're calling. Some endpoints, but not all, will offer certain filter terms to reduce the data set that they return, and we can use the @query annotation within our method signature to say, okay, this is a parameter that I want to pass on to my endpoint. So with that, we're going to take a look at how we can implement this, and one consideration is this entity relationship diagram where we have plants and specimens. Keep in mind that a plant is, in my definition, the scientific definition of a plant. Its genus, species, cultivar, maybe its fall color, how it seeds, those kind of things that we can say about all plants. Where an individual specimen is a specific plant that I have planted in a specific location. So one plant can have multiple specimens. And in our hands-on example, we'll see how we can exhibit this. So I hope this video has been helpful. Thank you.